What would happen if women were really empowered to take that strength that they gain in motherhood and just run with it?
Dr. Emma Svanberg, a renowned clinical psychologist specialising in perinatal mental health.
That comes all the way from their fertility journeys or even thinking about becoming parent.
We discuss the common challenges that new parents face.
I want to spend time with this child, and how am I going to do that and still succeed at work?
And we uncover Emma's valuable insights into fostering resilience and well-being.
The grief of not being able to do maybe all of the things that you thought you were going to be able to do. So having to let go of some aspects of your aspirations. Is it normal that I feel like this? Is it normal that my child is doing this? Is it normal that I hate my partner? Everything often comes down to, is what I'm feeling normal? And to me, the sort of question underneath that is what I'm feeling okay?
This episode is proudly sponsored by Mila, a therapy matching platform that makes finding the right therapist simple and personal. Mila connects you with a therapist that truly understands you. 9 out of 10 people find their perfect match with Mila. So if you're thinking about therapy, Mila's the place to go. It can help you find the support that feels right for you. Emma, thank you so much for joining me on CEO Mum.
Thank you, and it's lovely to be here.
I'd love to know, what are some of the common concerns that parents come to your clinic with?
People will come with those sort of very common mental health problems. So that comes all the way from their fertility journeys, if they're having fertility struggles, or even thinking about becoming parents. So the perinatal phase really can start all the way from just thinking about becoming a parent.
Are there some common reasons why?
It's a tricky sort of vicious cycle, because a lot of my work has been in birth trauma and in sort of educating people around the more difficult aspects of birth and that really early postnatal phase. So when we're talking about birth trauma, we might also be talking about traumas that happen during the pregnancy, also those very early experiences postnatally, like breastfeeding trauma or feeding difficulties, and all of the things that can kind of come along with that. Often the sort of theme throughout all of those experiences is not feeling looked after, or not feeling heard, or feeling that your body wasn't being treated with respect. So those are very common themes. Now that we're talking more openly about birth experiences, about the difficulties that people can have postnatally, there's a real strength in that, because people can come into their parenting journey with their eyes wide open and thinking about how to prevent some of those difficulties for themselves. But of course, the flip side of that is, for a lot of people, they're reading that and it's terrifying. And because of the way that it's then spoken about in the mainstream media, it will be these kind of big, quite scary headlines about birth trauma facts, or about the financial repercussions of becoming parents, about relationship impact. So if you're reading that as a teenager or a young person, then it's very common to then go, is that really what I want from my life?
Really
is this
kids?
Really what I want to go into? Which in some ways I think is incredibly sensible and wise. You know, people have a choice about becoming a parent. It's not a choice that everybody takes. So I think that people thinking carefully about what it's going to involve can only be a good thing. But if you then don't have the access to stories and experiences and support from people who can help you through those phases, then it can become quite an isolated and anxious experience.
Okay. I found that doing a hypnobirthing course during my pregnancy was really helpful, because it made me aware of things that I didn't even know about my body. I remember thinking, oh, I didn't know that about X, Y, and Z. And so because now I'm informed, I can make you informed, and I didn't find it very scary per se. I found it empowering because it was brought to my awareness rather than learning on the job. With your clients that are struggling with that financial concern when they become parents, for mothers that have to take time off, whether that's with maternity leave or without, what's your approach to helping somebody navigate that experience?
I mean, we are lucky in some ways in this country that often companies do give really good maternity leave, but it's still very uncommon for people to take shared parental leave. So because of that, it can often very quickly become one parent staying at home, usually the mum staying at home for a prolonged period of time. Even if you have a good maternity package, there is still questions about how that feels for you. So there's the sort of financial aspect, and then there's also your work identity, you know, who you are outside of the home. And that can shift so much in terms of, I mean, you've described it as really transformative. It is an identity transformation, like really your whole life just gets turned upside down. So this person that you were in work, you know, this kind of capable, competent person, I mean, not, you don't always feel capable and competent, but work is very directly rewarding often. And then all of a sudden you have this completely different status, you have a different lifestyle, your daily routine is completely upended. And so that that takes its toll on your identity and how you feel about yourself and who you are as a person in the world. And I think there is the kind of practical considerations of that. So there is that kind of, how does that feel for us in terms of our mental health, in terms of our identity, in terms of our sense of self-worth. But there's also then, how does it feel potentially being dependent on somebody else for your income, when you might have been independent financially up until that point. You might have choices to make about childcare, in terms of if you're staying off work, if you're able to do that, or if you need to go back to work, how are you going to juggle childcare and work responsibilities? And these are big questions that often we don't really talk about when we're preparing to become parents, and these are often still the questions that fall on mothers. So how am I going to juggle this one thing that's really important to me and that has been a huge part of my identity with this other identity that is now also extremely important to me, and I want to spend time with this child, and how am I going to do that and still succeed at work? And I think these are really difficult issues to resolve. Sometimes it's just about identity and kind of who I want to be and the sort of values that I want to live by, but there are also lots of practical considerations in all of that, like can you get childcare, can you afford to have childcare, can you afford to get a nanny, do you have family nearby, do you have a partner who's willing and able to share that childcare responsibility with you? So all of these questions that kind of come into it, as well as how flexible is your workplace. You know, what happens even if you do set up a really, efficient sort of childcare work juggle? What happens if your child is ill? Who's going to look after them in those kind of circumstances? So for each, you asked me the question, how do we sort of navigate that? It's very individual for all of those reasons, because everyone is in such different circumstances. Some people have a lot more support than others. Some people also have more financial means than others. But I think that often the key thing, or the thread that runs through my work with people around those issues, is around grief and loss, the kind of loss of identity, the grief of not being able to do maybe all of the things that you thought you were going to be able to do. So having to let go of some aspects of your aspirations, having to let go of some aspects of your identity, and really being able to then come up with something that feels good enough. So kind of letting go of an ideal often can happen for people, and then just settling in with, well, what feels workable, what's going to be good enough for me and my family.
Is that a common thing that people question? There are no identity forming in motherhood.
Often it's not even not spoken about, it's almost denied. Like, we kind of turn up as a new mum with our children and everyone treats us the same, and then we sort of get this message like we're meant to just show up as the same person that we always were.
Why is that?
I think motherhood is not honoured in our culture, and it's something that I think is shifting a bit. I'm going to talk about patriarchy, but I think, the kind of power of what happens to a woman when she becomes a mother, it can be transformational to the point where she becomes so empowered, learns to advocate for herself, learns to advocate for her children, learns to really tune into her body, all of these things that we kind of don't necessarily have to do, we don't have to face, and then we have to face them when we become mothers. And then really connecting deeply with these little people in our lives, again, that really makes us think about, what kind of person am I? What is it to be a human? What is it that I want for these children in this world? It's potentially a really empowering time of our lives, and that can be a bit scary. I think for the wider world, like, what would happen if women were really empowered to be able to take that strength that they gain in motherhood and just run with it? Like, what would the world look like if we were really supported in these transformative journeys? And we're not. And if anything, not only are we not supported, the pressure on new mothers just grows and grows and grows and grows. So there's always new things that we're not doing well enough. There's always new goals that we kind of should be setting for ourselves. There is this anxiety around motherhood that has grown in the time that I've been working in this field. And I do kind of think, not that it's a sort of necessarily a conscious decision, but I think that there is a potential to really flip that on its head. And if we supported mothers to be, the fully kind of recognised, empowered women that they can become in motherhood, I think, communities would look very different.
Does that make a difference whether or not a woman is going back to the workplace or not? Do they still feel empowered and on the path to feeling more empowered and confident, whether or not they decide to go back to their careers? Is identity solely attached to a career, would you say?
I don't think I think we can feel feel that it is. I think that because so often until we become parents, that has been the most important part of our identity. Like if you think about if you go to a party or if you go meet people that you don't know, the first question they ask you is, what do you do for work? It's something that is so prevalent in our society, in our culture, that this is, the thing that we sort of pin our identity on.
And because that's the first thing on. Hi, my name is so-and-so. I'm a XYZ.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of how we define ourselves. And then for a lot of women, if they then leave the workplace, even just for maternity leave, they can come with that a real sense of worthlessness when you then say, well, what do you do? Well, at the moment, I'm at home with my kids, and you see people's eyes sort of glaze over. That's how we treat mothers and children in our society and parents in general. So I think because of that, because identity can be so tied up in our work, it can be disempowering if we start to lose our connection to the workplace and to that sort of sense of our worth and identity is through our career. However, I think that there are lots of different ways that people work. I think that that's one of the brilliant things that's happened over the last 20 years is that people are doing much more those, like you do, the multi-hyphenate career where you can do lots of different things and still also be available to children.
Especially since COVID and the remote work that's
absolutely.
changing.
It's made a huge difference. But also I think, for people who then either choose to kind of work in a different way or leave the workplace entirely, that can lead to a different sort of identity shift in questioning the values that maybe you had agreed with before, that you believed before. You can bring things into your workplace or your career in terms of your advocacy, in terms of thinking about what feels more important to you now that you're a parent. But also you can question those values entirely and think about, well, actually, is my career the most important thing to me? Are there other things that are now important to me that actually I want to take precedence? And that's different for everybody. And again, very different depending on your circumstances and how much freedom you have to make some of those choices.
How do you determine what is important to you versus what is taking up the most of your time?
What a great question, because there's so many just chores, aren't there?
It's all important because we all need to keep this house running.
And it is all relentless, right? Because it never goes away. There's always laundry to do and there's always things to clean up. I think it's a really simple exercise is just to think about your value system. So one of the things that I talk about a lot is just really drilling down into what feels important to you. So one of the ways that we can do that is literally just write a list. What are the things that feel really important to me at the moment? And the things that might be on that list could be things like the practical things that I just have to do every day, like the laundry or like cooking or, cleaning up or, phoning your parents or whatever those things are that just have to get done, or often that you might also want to do. And then there might be the much bigger things that feel important to you, like connecting with my partner or spending time connecting with my children, whatever it might be. And then just look at that list and think about what you would happily get rid of. So what can go? And then you just carry on doing that until you're left with one or two key things. And that becomes your kind of value system. So let's say we choose this value of connecting with our family. That feels really important to me at the moment. It makes it much easier to say no to things that don't align with that value. So for example, let's say you get a phone call to do a piece of work that, doesn't pay particularly well, but it feels like quite a good opportunity. Does that align with my value of connecting with my family? Is it going to take me away from home for longer than it feels worthwhile? So it makes it kind of much easier to be able to make those sort of decisions and then to be able to say no to things that don't fit with that kind of core value that you've come up with.
With core values, would you say that self-care is the overarching theme of doing your value list?
So I think self-care is something that almost has to be our foundation to everything. It's not necessarily a value, it's like a must-have. And I think it's often the thing that we lose because so often the kind of unconscious values that we hold, particularly as mothers, are around self-sacrifice and martyrdom and giving. And that is something that has been really tied to postnatal depression in literature. And there are lots of questions about the kind of roles that we have to fulfill now as women and as mothers, and the kind of the burden of some of them. Many of them are really joyful and enjoyable and things that we want to do, but when there are just so many of them, inevitably it's going to become burdensome. And because of that, I think there's historically, we do have this narrative in our culture that if you're going to be a proper woman, then you're going to become a mother, and to be a good good mother, that means giving yourself to your children. Less so giving yourself to your husband these days, but of course that still exists. And I think it is still a kind of remnant of these very traditional patriarchal norms of what it is to be a family.
And so if we wanted to pick away at that tapestry and rebuild our own narratives, what are some of the small steps that we could do and take on board to move that forward into a more modern woman, or into a whole new idea of what you think a mother should be, and which is obviously individual for loads of people, but what are some of the small practical tips that people could do?
I think it's noticing it, first of all. So thinking about these kind of unconscious ideals that we often hold. And one of the things that really amazes the women that I work with is that, you know, they'll have come into motherhood as these really independent career women who have this identity outside of the home. And then as soon as they become mothers, and particularly even with their partners as well, they can just fall into these very traditional relationship dynamics that can really come as a complete shock. I think that in the last, I'm going to say 5 or 10 years, that's become really highlighted. Many more women are talking about their resentment at that, and the fact that it shouldn't land on women's shoulders, and the kind of gender disparity and the gender inequalities that still exist in family homes is something that is being spoken about much more, but we're still at a real standstill in terms of actual shift. So I think the first step is just noticing that, which I think many people do now and are very vocal about it and resentful of it. But then it's really thinking about how do we shift that on a both on an individual level in our own homes, and how do we shift it, which is the thing that I'm really interested in, how do we shift that on a societal level. It's a huge challenge, and I think it's a challenge that affects so many couples, and we're really seeing that now in the rates of divorce, in the fact that it tends to be women who ask for divorce from their partners, and of course for countless different reasons, but one of them being the resentment that grows over feeling burdened with things that we didn't actively choose.
Do you have any tips on managing that communication? I ask a lot of my guests, like, how do you talk about your domestic labour split in the house?
Absolutely.
How do you approach that? How would you advise a couple?
Yeah, I love this
Or a
question.
parent?
Thank you for asking, because I think we are making a lot of mistakes with how we talk about it at the moment because we're angry. When you're looking after small children, you can be very separate from your partner. You don't have a lot of time to talk about these things. When you do have time, you want to have a nice time. So you don't necessarily want to say, and actually I'm really annoyed with you because of this thing that happened this morning. But equally, because of the way that we talk about what has traditionally been women's labour as being small and insignificant, we don't feel like it's a significant or important enough thing to talk about. So let's say, for example, we're really annoyed because our partner didn't take the bins out when they went to work in the morning, and that was our expectation. That was something that maybe that has been agreed upon. That's going to be their role. Is that really going to be a thing that you bring like hours later when you're sitting down for dinner and you just want to have a nice time? It feels insignificant, but it's those things that, you know, it's death by a thousand cuts over a very long period of time. Those sort of things build up. For me, there's something about drilling down into the layer below, which is, what do those kind of repeated actions tell me about my role in our family and what is being expected of me? And it becomes then something that you can talk about as a shared problem. So when I say that I think we often are kind of coming into these discussions in a way that is just going to lead our partner to be defensive, it's because we have stored up so much rage, and then maybe we read something about the mental load on social media, and then your partner comes home and you're just like, all right,
let me tell you about mental load.
Let me tell you about emotional labour. And they're just like, well, hang on a second, where has all this come from? And we don't always consider the impact of those dynamics on them. You know, that let's say we're in a very traditional setup where a mother is staying at home on maternity leave, a dad has gone out to work. You know, they're dealing with their own issues too. They're also then losing out from the time that they could be spending with their child. It might not be something that is openly spoken about yet, but it is becoming more openly spoken about, that actually these sort of dynamics don't serve either partner. Both of them are missing out on time with their child, or time in the workplace, you know, that kind of equality of the dynamic. So I think if we can come into it as we have a shared problem, and this is something that we need to sort out, because I am feeling resentful when you go out in the morning and you don't take the bins out. It makes me feel like you're treating me in a way, you know, that it doesn't feel very respectful, or I feel like you're expecting too much of me. If we come at it as a shared issue, then we're much more likely to be able to come up with a shared solution. And it also then opens up opportunity for a partner to be able to say, well, these are the things that I don't like about this dynamic. And actually, men often don't have the opportunity to be vulnerable about those things, to be able to say, well, I really miss being at home with you and my child or my children. And I hate having to go out to work in the morning. And sometimes when I'm rushing out, I do forget about these things and I'm late for work already because I had to stop and change a nappy or whatever it might be.
Yeah, like there's there might be a reason to the story. It's not just that, oh, I'm lazy and I think you're going to do it if I don't do it.
Yes, exactly. Okay. And often, the things that sort of come up in those conversations are things about, it's not just about the bins. It's never just about the bins. It's about our family dynamic. It's about our relationship dynamic. It's about how we feel about our role.
My approach is I like to try, and this is a work in progress and I'm still figuring it all out, but to sort of make it very clear what our roles are so that it's highlighted, it's out there, it's not a kind of a thing that's just in our heads, invisible.
It's not an assumption.
It's not an assumption. And it allows things to, if there's something that's missing, to be placed on the table or in our Excel spreadsheet, whatever it is. Right. It makes it a bit formal, and it's always a little bit like, oh, why are we doing this? But I like a good spreadsheet. And I mean,
it's not very sexy, is it? This is the thing. This is why we don't do it, because it's not very sexy. And if, we're having time with our partners and we've had, a long week and we've been juggling childcare and we've both been working and we finally come back together again, it's like, and now in these 3 hours that we've got together, are we really going to talk about our household tasks? But it's so important to do that, because that's how you don't have those resentments building up. I mean, I often suggest that people have weekly family meetings. You might have one meeting with your partner to talk about your household admin, like the running of the household, and then you might have a meeting which is for the whole family to talk about what are the kind of things that are going well for us, what do we want to be happening for us as a family, what, to be able to resolve problems or conflicts that are coming up for you as a family. And you can even do that from when the kids are really little.
Yeah,
so
I love that.
It just really becomes part of your, weekly routine.
Because when you think about it, we have meetings in every other aspect of our lives. You do it with kids at school, parents' meetings. You do it in the workplace. You have quarterly reviews, annual reviews. Why would you not do it in your family, which is a community? It's obviously it's not a formal business, but it's something that is functioning that requires more than one person.
And there's a huge amount of admin involved.
Exactly.
Huge amount of admin. So why wouldn't you have a meeting to divvy that up? I think also, again, a lot of the time we don't do these things because of those unconscious assumptions. And a big part of my work is really helping people to kind of highlight really those sort of stories and narratives that they've carried from their own experience, from their assumptions about what family life is going to be like, that do really colour our everyday experience. So if you don't have those kind of discussions around who's going to do what is underlying that, often it is an assumption that you're just going to do everything. And that is something that needs to be highlighted and spoken about very openly, because where has that idea come from? Particularly if prior to having children, actually you were quite an equal partnership.
Thinking about assumptions, how do mothers navigate the impression that motherhood looks like this very glamorized, perfect, curated idea that you always got your makeup and hair done, blow dries looking on point, and you're always dressed in heels and gorgeous figure hugging dresses when you look online, to what the reality is when you probably are struggling to find time to have a shower?
So I think that I kind of want to really acknowledge that the pressure on women has exponentially grown, that these ideals have become even greater, even harder to achieve, much more unreasonable and unrealistic in terms of the sort of standards that they set. And I think that, like you were saying about kind of how do we deal with that? I mean, there is those kind of very obvious things, like think about what you're consuming on social media. So, these kind of things that we might see where somebody is looking a certain way or seems to have a certain very aspirational lifestyle. What else is going on that you don't see, like the nannies or the personal trainers or the cooks? And I wish people would talk openly about the help that they have.
What we're trying to do here,
in order to be able to, just show, well, if you want to have this kind of lifestyle, actually this is what it takes.
I find the term doing it all quite toxic, because I don't think anyone does do it all alone.
No, and the all has just grown. I mean, and grown and grown and grown, so that we have to have our own business and look a certain way and be a certain way in our relationships and, be kind of constantly available. I think, again, it comes back to values. When you just relax into, what is it that feels really important to me, it can really help you then think about how to let go of some of those aspirations or expectations.
Before we continue with that interview, I just want to say that this episode is proudly sponsored by Mila. Mila is a therapy platform that makes finding the right therapist simple and personal. Mila connects you to a therapist that truly understands you. 9 out of 10 people find their perfect match with Mila. So if you're thinking about therapy, Mila can help you find the support that feels right for you. Now back to the episode. I want to go to navigating parental leave because that kind of leads really nicely into how women can transition back into their careers. How do you think is the best way to navigate 50-50 parental leave? Is that the most healthy setup for those early stages?
I think it's an ideal for lots of families. I think that at the moment, even though it's been kind of policy for a long time, we are still in a situation where lots of I'm going to say secondary caregiver, so it could be dad, could be, a kind of same-sex parent, doesn't always have the opportunity to take off as much time, because even though it is policy, it might not be something that is kind of really recognised within their workplace. It's really unfair, I think, that so many parents lose out on the opportunity to have that time, really formative time, to get to know their child and for their child to get to know them. We are really not very good at making sure that dads get to spend time with their children. So for example, these kind of lesser issues that we don't always talk about, for let's say a dad who does take time off to spend time with his child, often he might then go to a baby group and be the only man there. How does that feel?
Like 2 days ago when I went to the lovely little music class around the corner from my house, and there was one dad there, which was lovely, but he was the only man.
And often, everyone's talking about birth and breastfeeding, and can actually not be particularly welcoming to dads. And I think it is part of it's something that we need to shift. Somehow we need to shift it together in making parenting something that involves all parents and caregivers. It's not a mother's only space.
For sure.
But there's so many things that make it much more kind of mum-centred.
Yeah, I mean, my WhatsApp groups are mum groups. They're literally called the mums of the area.
Yes.
Not parents of the area.
No.
There aren't any dads in that group. Maybe there is a separate dad group that I don't know about and
There
Tyson's
won't
not
be.
involved in, but I very much
it's unlikely.
feel like it's a space that has lots of potential.
It has lots of potential, but it's it's the kind of, it has to start with something. And often people will start, maybe they'll set up a dad's group that's really quiet, or there'll be a parents group, but it's a trickle, and at some point we reach a critical mass where things shift, and both parents or all parents and caregivers are involved in thinking about how do we raise our children.
How do you protect self-care when you are time poor?
I think finding whatever ways you can to hold on to the person that you are. So it doesn't have to be bubble baths or going to the spa or sitting journaling. It doesn't have to be things that take time. It's just about connecting with yourself. So remembering who you are as an individual, away from your mothering, away from these tasks, like who am I?
I remember feeling so good when I could just go upstairs and have 10 minutes to shower and just put my head back and just put a little bit of makeup on. It wasn't for anybody else. I wasn't even leaving the house, but it was just for me to feel like I was myself again.
Totally. And often it is that, or it's going and lying on your bed in a starfish for 10 minutes in the dark. And I think sometimes we will look at self-care as being the kind of big things. I'll often ask clients, are you going to be able to have some time for yourself, because they've been running on empty for a really long time, and they'll say, well, I'm going to go for lunch with my girlfriends, or I'm going to go away for the weekend with my other friend or with my partner.
But I also find that is like exerting energy.
That's still exerting, and often you're still giving, so it depends on who you're with, but often you're still having to perform, you're still having to do, you're still having to give. It's about taking moments just to be, and just to be doing absolutely nothing. And also, again, thinking about it from a really physiological perspective, well, if I'm overstimulated because I've been getting pulled at and poked, and there's been, some tinny plastic toy playing music for the last 2 hours, do I want to go for brunch, or actually do I just need to go and sit in a dark room with some headphones in and an eye mask on and a lovely heavy blanket and just decompress? So if you're time poor, the best way you can think about looking after yourself is physiological things that just help you restore the energy to your body. So deep rest. Also really quick and easy things like just stopping where you are, putting your hand on your heart and just taking 3 really long slow breaths. A really good trick is just remembering that your out breath, if you really elongate your out breath, so you do a breath in through the nose and then just a big when you take a longer out breath, it just tells your body
we can do that all together now mode. So you breathe in
through your nose and then
that feels really nice.
and you just feel it kind of really let the breath leave your body, so right from the bottom of your belly. And I often say to parents, particularly when they're in a really high stress moment, don't just do an out breath, do like a big loud sigh or a big roar. And you can do that with your kids. So if there's often these trigger points during the day, so it's in the morning when you're getting everyone out the house, in the evening when you're trying to get everyone ready for bed, those are the times when people tend to lose their patience. So you can say to your children, oh, I'm starting to feel really fizzy. So that's a word that I use a lot. You don't have to say stress, you don't have to say anxious, just say I'm starting to feel a bit fizzy in my body, because it really helps kids then tune into their own body. I'm just going to put my hand on my heart, and I'm just going to take 3 long big sighs. And then you just do it with them. Do you want to do it with me? Oh, and you do a big sigh and you let your shoulders drop, and they'll just laugh. And it can often break the tension, or as they get older, like my kids do, they just sort of roll their eyes at me like, there she goes again. But it just allows you to get out of that fight or flighty place where you're starting to get reactive, and it just grounds you back in your body, and it gives you that chance to just pause, even when they're all around you and there's chaos going on, to just pause and let yourself reset into your body.
And I'm an introvert, so I've just transformed into this extrovert of giving energy, speaking all the time, singing all the time, explaining everything that I do, because I heard that that's really good. I am now cooking, I am washing the dishes, I'm driving myself crazy, but I've become this extrovert. So
I cannot tell you the amount of conversations that I have with people where, and I've done it too, of course, you kind of read a piece of information and you go, okay, that's what I should be doing for my children, because that's what it is. And again, thinking about the underlying assumption, if I want to be a good mum, this is what I need to be doing for my children, so I'm going to sort of speak to them. And you kind of get into this commentary that we do. But actually, if you think about the fact that you are going to be in relationship with these 2 children for the rest of your life, they are going to know you better than you know yourself.
That is
and
true.
They do see all of us, absolutely all of us. So you might as well start now as the person that you are. That actually, if you don't feel like talking, you can say, I really feel like being quiet. So much about our relationship building with children is about how we feel with each other. So that's what co-regulation is, right? It's that I am using my nervous system to regulate your nervous system. So if you have a child who's crying, and you, very naturally, we do this, we take a few deep breaths to calm ourselves so that we can show up for them, be calming and present and soothing for them. They're feeling that calm in our body. And young children, particularly pre-verbal children, are so attuned to our nervous system, to how we feel. So being able to, that is the best thing we can do for ourselves and our children, is to prioritise just our regulation of our bodies, and doing that in a way that works for us. And sometimes that is absolutely not the things that you read about or the things that you feel like you should be doing. It might be actually for the next 2 hours we're going to be in silence, and actually where everyone's going to be pottering around doing their thing, and maybe we're playing but we're not talking very much, or we've got some music on in the background, because that's what I need to feel calm right now.
I have thought about this, because I did read something recently that was along the lines of, if you read X amount of books to your children, then they will learn and develop a vocabulary of X amount more words than the general person. But a lovely part of life for me has also been reflecting, going out. So we do go out for walks, whether it's me or Tyson or the help and support network that we have. Us take the babies out for a walk. At least they spend an hour a day outside, and they're in quiet, and they're absorbing their surroundings. They're just sitting around. Who knows what they're thinking about? Probably that they're hungry, or they want
look at that
to
amazing
get out.
leaf, or look at the shadows.
Exactly.
But
I find that if they have that moment of silence, why can't that also be in the house? Because I do find that does level out the noise, level out the energy, and just gets everyone kind of coming together. And just, it's not always possible, but I do try to part a little bit of that in the day. For me.
And it's for you, right? What works for you. And actually what's really amazing is, even with very little babies, you can see that when you just sit and breathe deeply and calm yourself, that they become more watchful. One of my favourite ever research studies, which was done in the early 90s, was showing, it was one of the first studies around learning in the womb. And it was the way that babies are learning even when they're in the womb. So they did this study where they looked at women who'd watched Neighbours during their pregnancy, and then what happened if they played the Neighbours theme tune after the babies were born.
Oh wow.
And the babies would still, and they'd become more alert. And it's because they'd learn, this is the time that mum sits down and relaxes.
Oh wow.
So it was like a kind of low cortisol, low stress hormones kind of a time. And children will learn that very quickly. this is the time that mum sits down and has a cup of tea, we can utilise that, because what we tend to do is that we do that based around them and getting them into a routine and making sure that all of their needs are being met. But as part of that, how do we make sure our needs are being met? So can we have 20 minutes where, actually maybe when we get in the bath, everyone gets in the bath together, and that's something that becomes a kind of soothing experience. Or maybe it's not the bath. So for some kids, the bath's really exciting. So can it be, just when we're sitting together on the sofa and we've got some music playing in the background and we're just kind of pottering around together. So thinking about those ways that you can bring that, what you need, what's important for you in terms of your personality and your temperament, and how does that fit with your children? Because often we can really try and be somebody else for our children. We can try and be the person that we feel that they need, and we have this kind of checklist in our minds of these are the things that I need to be doing in order to be able to do that well. But then we lose sight of who we are in that. And it can just be so hard to sustain. That's when we end up really stressed.
Oh, 100%. I'm a freelancer. I took a little bit of maternity leave that I saved up enough money for to support me peacefully, and then at a certain point decided it was time to get back to work 1 day a week, 2 days a week, and it was a slow start of integrating myself back into working. That was something that made me feel really good and made me be able to have more energy to show up better when I did have the time with the babies. I found that it was really easy for them to not miss me or know any different, because I did that from quite early on. Now, if a mother is wanting to reintegrate into the workplace, but they're at a point now where their babies are used to them being with them 24/7, and it's a big shock. We've had people say that their babies are crying till they're throwing up because they're not used to other caregivers. What's the best way to approach that?
So I think what's really interesting about what you've said is that children can go through these different phases anyway. So whether they're used to being around all the time or not, actually there are often particular points in children's development that they will show more separation anxiety. And that might be for loads of different reasons. So maybe they have something physical going on, like they're teething or they're not feeling very well. And all of a sudden you're really surprised because your child is crying for you and they never really minded before. Often it can happen around the year mark, which is really often when people are going back to work. So that is a kind of prime separation anxiety time. There's so much developing for them all at once. They become much more aware of different people in their lives. So their attachment relationships are starting to become a bit more complex. So at times like that, we can demonstrate to our children, that all of a sudden our children are like, wow, this, they'll kind of show us very clearly that they don't want us to leave them. I think first of all, preparation is really important. So being able to talk to your child, even if they're tiny, being able to talk to them about what happens. I talk a lot about storytelling. So we're almost telling stories to our children. Mum's going to go out, I'm going to be back at this time. You can even say, this is what I'm going to be doing. And then when I come home, this is what I'm going to do. Having a little ritual to reconnect can be really important. Even if it's just whenever we see each other, we give each other a big cuddle, which is something that, you just really commonly do. Or it might be, that when you reunite, you have a kind of special thing that you do together, that you do every single time you see each other for the first time again. People can often sort of be slightly afraid of that, because people can often feel that it's going to raise their child's anxiety if they know what's coming. But actually knowing can, even if they show anxiety, that is them processing this change that is going to happen in their lives.
Because they're going to show the anxiety anyway.
They're going to show the anxiety anyway, and you'd rather they process it with you than you've left and they have to process it with somebody else. So being able to talk about what's going to happen, we have to be okay with the fact that they might protest that, they might be upset about that, they're going to miss us. That's really healthy, a normal thing for them to do. But we can then reassure them, and I'm going to come back, and this is what happens when I come back. There are lovely books on the market around, how we can come back together. So there's things, I think there's one called The Invisible String. There's a lovely one called The Kissing Hand for Chester Raccoon. That was one that I remember using when my kids were little. People have different kind of little strategies that they can use, like drawing something, like a little button, a hug button, or a little heart or something on your hand, where you can say to your child, you can press that when you think of me. The things that can keep you connected. People, and when their kids are older, might write a little note for their child to read, leaving things like a picture of you around so that they feel like you're still connected to them. Particularly for very little children who don't have an awareness of time, they can just feel like you're gone and you're gone forever. So they might feel really aggrieved about that, like they should feel aggrieved about that, because it's part of their survival, like where is my caregiver gone? But over time they will get used to the fact that when you leave, you always come back. So that's really the kind of message that we want to give to our children. We're separating, and it can feel hard to separate, and I'm going to miss you and you're going to miss me, and then we're going to come back together again, and that's going to be lovely.
And it's part of the process, and
It's
it
part of the
shouldn't
process.
hinder what you want to do and progress.
No, well, I think that it's really important to also find caregivers that you trust, and I think that can be a really difficult thing for people, particularly at the moment where, childcare can be really expensive, prohibitively expensive for a lot of families. So being able to find childcare with somebody that you trust to be able to look after your child in a way that feels okay for you, it shouldn't be so difficult, but it is.
Many mothers feel this mum guilt, which is guilt, not mum guilt.
Yeah,
Why
we
do
never call it
mums
dad
only have
guilt,
it?
do we? We never say dad
Parent guilt. I mean, it's just guilt, isn't it? Let's just talk about guilt, particularly in motherhood, especially with balancing work and parenting. How can they navigate this emotional challenge?
Oh, wouldn't you just love to live in a world where mums don't feel guilty, or just where women don't feel guilty, because often it's women just feel guilty about so many different things. I mean, first of all, it is about often this kind of juggle between the things that we want for ourselves and the things that we want for our children and the things that our children want from us. And because being a mum is often so tied up in our identity as women in a way that it just isn't really for men, it can feel like a really fundamental thing when we are acting in a way that feels like we're sort of going against what our children are expressly saying or expressly asking of us. Because if we think about the kind of implicit assumption of this kind of self-sacrificial mothering that we talked about earlier, one of those assumptions is that I will always do what my children want from me. I will not upset my children, or I will not, leave my children feeling abandoned by me. These are the kind of really core things that kind of come into our daily life, and until we raise them up and actually look at them and bring them out from our unconscious, they can often just be there lurking in the background, affecting our behaviour, but we don't really know why.
Just this like looming pressure.
Just a pressure. Why do I feel like this guilty about leaving my child to go and do something that actually I know is going to be good for me, it's going to be good for our family, and I know that they're okay. And if you think about in so many other cultures where children are parented by, or care, there are lots of different caregivers. Traditionally, what we understand is that most of us were brought up in a kind of allo-parenting environment where there'd be loads of different adults and older children, and not necessarily even family members, but lots of people around to care for children. Again, going back to how we do things in this country, which is very individualistic, that means that all of that guilt, shame, responsibility lands on our shoulders as women. So I think being able to kind of just question some of those assumptions that underlie the feelings is how we begin to navigate dealing with those emotions that come up for us. So let's say, for example, I feel really guilty about leaving my child to go to work today. Why? Because they're upset and they were protesting as I was leaving the house. So why does that bother you so much? That they've been left with somebody who's going to take care of them, because they're going to feel like I don't love them. Or maybe they're going to feel like I'm abandoning them. Or maybe they're going to feel like they're not the most important thing in the world to me. And I really want them to know that they're the most important thing in the world to me. So how do we deal with that? So it's not about dealing with the guilt. It's about dealing with whatever belief or
the mental model
idea
you've set out for yourself
that is underlying that feeling of guilt. And it's going to be different for everybody, right? And often it is based on both our stories that we're telling about what mothers do and who mothers are and what parents are like, but it might also be based on our own childhood experiences. So maybe we had an experience of feeling abandoned as a child that we really don't ever want our child to feel. That might be something that is driving a lot of our behaviour and a lot of our feelings. So that's the thing that we need to think about, rather than what am I going to do about this moment leaving the house.
My last question is, what is one of the questions that you get asked a lot?
Is this normal? Is it normal? Is it normal that I feel like this? Is it normal that my child is doing this? Is it normal that I hate my partner? Is it normal that I really don't want to go back to work? Or is it normal that I'm desperate to go to work? Everything often comes down to, is what I'm feeling normal? And to me, the sort of question underneath that is what I'm feeling okay? Like, am I an okay human being to be feeling these mixed emotions? And my answer is always yes. My answer is always, it's all normal, because being a human is very messy and full of very messy emotions and experiences. And, that realm of normality is absolutely vast.
And if there was one piece of advice that maybe you find that you are dishing out a lot, or a piece of advice you think that would add the most value to a new mum transitioning into motherhood, what would that piece of advice be?
Oh, I find this a really hard question to answer because there's so many different pieces of advice that I'd love to give. But I think to find people that you can share your experiences with. Support, yes, like practical support, absolutely, we need that. But thinking about what you said before about the WhatsApp groups, there's something about this time of life potentially being so transformative, having people going through that with you who will support you on that journey and will be really happy for you when you shift into the kind of next incarnation of yourself. Having those people around you is so important.
That can relate and that can understand the highs, the lows, the late nights,
absolutely.
The early mornings.
And don't judge you and don't make you feel like you should be doing things in a certain way, but I'm just there
value,
for
because I think the biggest shift that I had was being valued for a lot of my career accolades to then this assumption that maybe people in my industry don't really understand the hard work that is going into this new transition of motherhood. But new mums do understand it, or new parents do understand it and appreciate it and understand the scope of that responsibility and that transformation. And I think having that community around, just to reiterate what we were saying, is really useful. Parenting for Humans, can you share like a top line of what that book is about?
Yeah, so it's sort of the book that I really want people to read before they read any parenting books. So it's a book about yourself as a parent and the sort of themes and experiences and ideas that we bring as people to our parenting journey. Often what I find when I'm talking to clients is that they'll read a parenting book or they'll see something on Instagram or listen to something on a podcast and they try and apply it in their own family life and then something just doesn't quite click. And for me, there's been a real missing piece of that conversation, which is how do we show up as parents and what is it that we bring in terms of our own experiences, the sort of feelings that we have, the environment that we live in, that then mean that we can't always parent in the way that we intend to. So it's really helping people get to know themselves and what they bring in order to be able to parent the child that they actually have, not the sort of ideal textbook children that we often get sold.
And children are so different and how you have to show up for each one is so different. And you're just learning on the job. Like you leave the hospital, you don't even get your medical record back. They're just like, see you later, enjoy them. That's what everyone said to me. It's been so lovely to have you. If somebody wanted to find out a little bit more about you or say hi, where can we connect with you?
So I spend far too much time on Instagram. So I am Mumologist on Instagram, or people are welcome to email me. So my website's dresvanberg.com, so they can find me. And I'd love for people to read my book. And if they do, I know people are kind of working their way through it very slowly because there's lots of reflective exercises in there. So
brilliant.
If anyone does read it, I'd love to hear from people about how they're finding it.
And just to reiterate, your book is called Parenting for Humans. Where can we buy it?
Just most usual bookstores. It's also on Audible, read by me. So
lovely. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma, for joining us.
Thank you. It's been lovely.
If you enjoyed that episode or found it interesting, inspiring, or it connected with you in any way, please share it with a friend that you think would love it too. Your support means the absolute world and helps us reach more people with these stories. For more information about our guest or anything else that you've listened to today, be sure to check out the show notes below. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye.